Good afternoon. My name is David Kohlberg, and I'm the Senior Director of Government Affairs at Palatal Networks. Let me begin by welcoming everyone to our session today. In a moment, we'll turn to our speakers, but just a few housekeeping items before we begin. All participants, with the exception of our speakers, will be muted throughout the session and will not be allowed to enable their video. You may submit real-time questions by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the window. We will be leaving plenty of time for questions during the second half of the session, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions from the audience as possible. Again, we thank you all for joining, and it is my pleasure to introduce Palatal Networks Vice President for Cybersecurity Strategy and Global Policy, Ryan Gillis.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you all for joining us again today. This is the 6th year of the Joint Service Academy Cyber Summit. As many of you know, this is developed first with 2 at West Point, 2 years in Annapolis. This would have been the 2nd year out at Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy. Having participated, like many of you, in all of these throughout the years, I've noticed 2 things that have particularly developed. One is the community that has been engendered by and around this event. We started with the basis of bringing together the service academies with senior leaders from across government, and throughout, that has continued to exceed expectations in the events that we've had, from cabinet secretaries to tremendous participation across the Flag and General Officer Corps, from the Joint Chiefs, the SOOPs of each of the academies, the service cyber commanders. We've had 5 directors of the National Security Agency, as well as deputy directors, CEOs and execs across sectors, including the CEO of the Girl Scouts, who continues to be a strong part of this, leaders in the venture capital community, execs across the board that are here for what has become substantive discussions and a call to action. So that community that we've brought together of decision makers, of people that are at the tip of the spear, leads to substantive discussion and outcome focused. And that's what we've hoped to bring to you in the virtual environment here, as we are all beholden to a COVID world. So we actually honestly weren't certain that this community would translate into an online event. Given the high level of participation, we just didn't know if folks at this level would dial into something like this, absent some of the networking and the personal relationships that has made JSAC what it is. And this being the 2nd event, I'll tell you, it really exceeded all expectations in the first virtual event that we did, with the level of participation. Folks like, again, Sylvia Acevedo, from CEO of the Girl Scouts, cyber leaders from across the uniformed services and industry, just dialing in to be part of this. And so we want to continue the discussion today with this distinguished group we brought together. And again, not for the sake of discussion, but for the sake of impact. So the one thing that we are all dealing with right now is a remote workforce across the US and around the globe. And it is at the heart of the JSAC mission to help share and identify best practices that can be implemented for securing a remote workforce. So today we've brought in some tremendous folks. Brian Ware, the Assistant Director for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security at DHS. Sean Riley is the CIO for the state of North Dakota. And Jeff Green is the Director for the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence at NIST. So Brian, if you would kick us off, please, and let us know where you'd like to start framing things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. And thank you everyone for participating today. And I'm glad to get to give you just a couple minutes of scene setting remarks. And the first thing I want to say is that remote working isn't for all of us just like doing the old job that we did, but doing it outside the office. In fact, many agencies, many companies have taken on whole new missions, or at least had to increase the priority of missions that are new, that are just because of this environment that we're in. And so for us in particular, we have been concerned about phishing and other activities that may take place where COVID was going to be used as a lure. So we've had to, beef up our efforts there to secure government agencies and businesses against those kinds of scenarios. We've been really concerned about ransomware that would target the public health response in hospitals. We've seen this in other countries in Europe and overseas. And so we've had to increase the number of our focus on those issues, as well as PHF, which is always public health information, has been an attractive target for adversaries. Certainly one that we have to be more enticing in this era. And then there's the espionage activities that foreign governments do, but focus now on really kind of two things at the same time. One of them is taking advantage of a remote workforce, or maybe a distracted workforce, or a workforce who's designed to counter them being away from their cloud work environments or their typical work environments. One is kind of the expectation that our adversaries are going to take advantage of a change in posture, but also those adversaries are going to be seeking our intellectual property that's going to come from our pharmaceutical companies and our lab and our research institutions. And so I just wanted to initially say that these are all parts of what CISA did before COVID, but they were not our priority missions, priority targets of our adversaries. And so even while we're in this telework environment, we've had to significantly change our operating posture and our priorities. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that kind of at the start. My colleague in the UK said something I thought was really insightful, and he said that we have to, his agency, the National Cybersecurity Center, we have to secure the technology as I know my colleagues on this panel share, that is an important, and again, it's always been a part of the job, but it's a new part of the job in terms of its priority. So the way I kind of am trying to think about this is that the enterprise perimeter, whatever that perimeter was in January, that perimeter now extends into every home of every one of our remote workers. And that means that we have to do a lot better job of understanding what the security posture is in the home, and where there may be, a 10-year-old router, an internet-connected refrigerator, and a teenager that's on TikTok. What does that do to our cybersecurity posture? Do we have the appropriate teleworking products in place to ensure the security and privacy of the work that we're doing? Have our CIOs and CISOs configure their operating environments in such a way that they're able to extend the security perimeter out and also monitor for security risks? And so I feel like this environment is just absolutely challenging, but it's going to lead to some amazing innovations and capabilities as we move forward. And so maybe with that, Ryan, I'll take a pause.
Sean Riley, you're at the tip of the spear for not only helping your state from critical infrastructure and individuals secure themselves, but also agencies. Could you talk through some of how you're approaching things at the state level?
Thank you, Ryan. So state of North Dakota is in somewhat of a unique situation in comparison to most other states. So from a cyber perspective, we have all aspects of government within a single cyber defense organization. And what that means is what we lovingly call the 7 branches of government. I know we were all taught when we were in 4th grade that there were only 3, but there's a few more in the real world. And what we defend on a day-to-day basis is we defend all of the traditional 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. But we also have higher ed, we also have K-12, we also have cities, we also have counties. And with that, then we have about 250,000 people that we defend on a day-to-day basis. And as COVID became a very, very real pandemic for all of us, and we all had to start thinking differently about how we did our work, we also really had to think differently about how government was managed and how government is really being delivered on a day-to-day basis. So in the state of North Dakota, we were a couple of weeks behind everyone else on the coast for as the virus moved inwards towards the center of the country. We had a couple of weeks of really prep time to be able to understand what was about to happen and understand what we were about to go through. So we, in a period of about 4 days, we moved 252,000 people out of all of those environments I just stated, moved all of those into either a telework or a teleschool environment. The entire executive branch was moved in about 48 hours. We then had to do some things that were really unprecedented. And for those that know my bio, I'm a private sector guy. I've always been a private sector guy, and my job literally at some point was to do crazy things. That's actually been in my job description, do crazy things before. But I will say some of the stuff that we were doing with the state of North Dakota way exceeded my version of crazy even. We stood up a new education system for all of K-12 in 4 days' time. We stood up contact tracing in 6 days' time for the entire state. Contact monitoring for the entire state, new data systems in 12 hours, 24 hours. So this huge technology swing. And about 65% of our entire environment in the executive branch alone had never worked remotely, didn't even have the right equipment to go remotely. They all have desktops still and those kind of things. Well, we had to forklift all these environments, send them home, and do it with very, very, very little planning. And unfortunately, the bad guys knew that was happening. The bad actors side, they have been able to take advantage of all sorts of attacks against all of our entities. It really changed the threat surface. Now, the great thing is from our technology back end, we've had some amazing capabilities to defend ourselves. But when you look at those typical numbers, typically, we get 15, 20 million attacks a month against our front door. The actual number that we care about are the incidents that come through into the system in which our SOC teams and defense teams actually have to worry about. We went from about 1,500 per week incidents that we were dealing with across the entirety of the system to a little over 7,000 per week as soon as COVID came in. It changed the entire vector of how we had to defend ourselves and how we had to think about defense. Just a real simple example, 252,000 people, this luckily was only 70 of them that had this problem, but 70 of the folks that went home, when they went home, they thought that they should plug their work device directly into the modem that they had from their ISP. And they thought that was a good idea because, hey, then I'm cutting out the wireless network in between and I'm more secure that way. The unfortunate part was the particular ISP modems that they were plugging into were of a very particular revision that had no firewalls. And 70 people just instantly went straight out onto the internet and were grabbing a publicly accessible IP address. That's one I can smile about now. I can tell I was not smiling the first week when they were going through these. But lots and lots of new incidents, lots of new attacks, lots of things that were directly related to World Health Organization attack and directly related to Department of Health and Health and Human Services, where people were focused on to the virus and fighting the virus, and yet the bad actors, they knew that people were going to be going there, so they went that way. So within the state of North Dakota, we've had to rise to that challenge. It's definitely been a wild ride, a lot of things to be able to take on, but we'll talk more about that in the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation.
Thanks, Sean. Jeff, I think NCCOE gave you a month on the job before having to adapt and reform the entire actions of the organization around a quarantined environment. So can you tell us a bit about how you guys are focused right now, guidance for the ecosystem and that sort of stuff?
Sure, yeah, it was 5 weeks, so let's not undersell how much time we have. But first, Sean, someday I want to get a job with do crazy things in my job description. I have a new item for my, I guess we call it a bucket list. So I appreciate this call has been good for me for that alone. But yeah, so I joined the NCCOE on February 3rd. For those who don't know the NCCOE, we are Cybersecurity Center of Excellence in NIST. We are part of the Information Technology Lab, but we sit separate. We have our own building a few miles off campus with a dozen or more labs where we're building out projects. Our goal is to bring together industry and the private sector, the government, academia, and we identify issues that we think are addressable with current technology. And then we build out a solution along with our partners and publish it. So very hands-on environment. 2/3 of our building is the physical labs. 1/3 of it is space that's designed for us to host events and bring people in. So collaboration is really what we do. We do it virtually. We have done it virtually. We are now uniquely doing it virtually. So to Ryan's point, there were parts of our operation that shifted dramatically, which is, we were to have had a meeting with all of our, we call them NCEP partners, 42 of them in Austin in April. We had to move that virtually. We had a few events that we are working on rescheduling. Our workforce, though, was fairly well set up to go remote. So that was not a significant issue. What we've been working on is being able to continue our lab work. Some of our projects focus on remote aspects of IT, so that has been good. Other pieces we've been adapting on the fly. In terms of what we have tried to do, the NCCOE's projects historically have taken a year to 18 months to build out. And one of the things that I'd been talking with folks at NIST when I came on board was looking for ways that we could introduce new types of work products. We don't want to stop what we're doing. The builds and the projects are particularly helpful as an educational point for a lot of the companies we work with. The guides that we've put out have led to practical improvements in industry and in the public sector, so we want to continue that. But feedback that I got consistently when I was at RSA, my last trip now for who knows how long, but at RSA I heard folks wanted us to be more nimble. They wanted us to get products out more quickly. And early on in this transition, I was talking with some other folks at NIST, and I was thinking that a couple of the things that we might be able to help on. One is obvious, get out some telework guidance. NIST has a couple of special publications that have been out for a while now, 800 series, 46 and 114 on bring your own device and on telework security. So we thought we could summarize that in more of a bite-sized chunk combined. They're about 90 pages. But the second thing that occurred to me one morning was thinking about my own practices with virtual meetings and conference calls. My security practices were abominable, and I was a lawyer by training, worked on the Hill and the Homeland Security committees and then cybersecurity. So I'm about as paranoid as you can get. But I realized that for years I'd been reusing conference call numbers and doing other things that just fundamentally insecure. And when I distilled it down, what really thought about was I wasn't viewing these calls and these meetings as data exchanges. I was viewing them as a call. And putting it in that new light, it made me wonder if I was the only person. So I ran it by a few friends, public sector and at NIST, and there was a general reaction like, that's probably pretty common. So we rushed to put together some telework, some virtual meeting and conference call tips that we vetted with our partners. We have, as I said, 42 NCEP partners and the ability to go to them, get feedback, reality checks. And in about a week, we put together a blog and a one-pager with some basic security suggestions as you go into a virtual meeting. And the threshold for all security is use common sense. But the threshold tool that we suggest people apply is approach a call like you would any type of data or any type of security, classify it low, medium, high, and then move forward from that standpoint, thinking about how and what you need to do to make sure that you are having a secure exchange of information, and at the same time, making it as accessible as possible for whoever needs to get on it. A call like this, which is fairly widely open, is going to have a different level of security than a board meeting. A completely public call is going to be perhaps more open than this one. And we've been adapting that on the fly, but that has been one of our biggest hits on our blog in the past few years. So I guess we struck some kind of nerve. And now what we're doing, follow on to that, is I mentioned the 2 publications that are out there. They are a little old, about 4 years. So we are working with our partners to come up with ideas on what we would do in the next iteration of a Telework and BYOD security publication. And then instead of waiting throughout the entire updating process, we're going to put out a thought piece, a white paper. It won't be official NIST guidance, but it will be a collection of best practices and best ideas that we get internally from industry partners, from academia, from government. Put that out and say, here are some things that you should think about in the short term, and we in the long term are looking to update our official guidance and publications, and please come play with us and help us make these as good as possible. So Ryan, I'll kick it back to you. It gives a sense of where we've been.
That's great, Jeff. I do think you've done a great job in making this stuff digestible and accessible, which is always a challenge in cybersecurity. You know, referring somebody to page 72 in the fine print is not the way to get secure practices across. And so making this something that's easy to reference, I think, is important. Would you mind just talking a little bit about how you're prioritizing and getting to the 3 main audiences in this? The individual user, you sort of went into your own personal experience. How do I secure myself? How do I think about security of what I always thought was a meeting and now is a data exchange? To the security and IT professionals, how do you give them guidelines so they know how to put the configurations in, either for a meeting like this or more broadly as you transition from a data center to a cloud-based environment? And thirdly, to the executive community, much of whom is on today as well. So how do you help them understand how to hold their people's feet to the fire as their tech folks and their individuals and they themselves are going through this transformation?
So historically, the NCCOE has been focused at the enterprise level. This was a little bit new to us to be focusing on the individuals. And by the enterprise, I mean the executive level to the CISO level to the operational level. We hadn't really focused on the end user quite as much. But to give an example of a bulletin we put out that summarized our telework guidance, we split that essentially into 2 pieces, and same with the blog. Half of it was focused on the user. Here's what you need to do at home. Check your router. See if your router is patching and updating regularly. Make sure you have a complex password. Are you using the right security? Basic things for the home user. The second half of it was for the IT manager who is suddenly managing an incredibly larger workload of teleworkers. You might have had, you have 5x of what you had before, or Sean said it's 4 days to 240,000. So try to do that in a bite-sized chunk. So that was one approach. And the same thing with the Telework blog. We also did the virtual meeting, which was very much end user. This is what you need to think about for your own meetings and others you're setting up. In our longer bulletins, we have NCCOE practice guides, or what's called an 1800 series. Those are the year to 18 month. They're split into 3 pieces. Section A is designed to get at the executive level, not getting into the weeds, but what is the problem? What does this guide address? Why should you care? That's also a little bit to the CISO level to say, here are the things that we think will be useful for you to make the case to the executives as to why they should invest time and resources. The next level, the section B, is a little more detailed. It describes the build that we did, the technology partners that we've used, and gives a sense of the architecture that we're doing. So if you want to try to copy that, you can do that with other vendors. You can do that with the ones that we've used. The final section C is the 400-page version, which gets down into the weeds of the very specific builds that we have done in our labs. It's a how-to guide. If you want to build what we built and we have shown to be successful, these are the granular settings that you'll need to apply to whatever devices and software you apply. We are looking as we go forward and publish new 1800 series to try to even take it down a little finer at the A level. These ideas of a one-pager, putting out some videos, looking at how people consume information today. And we did that with, I should have mentioned, the Telework blog and the virtual meeting. We were able to put out 90-second companion videos. I know when I need to figure out something around my house now, I'm more likely to go to a video than I am something written. So maybe a little late, but we're trying to adapt to how we think people are taking in information.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I was impressed with your video. I didn't expect to see that on the NIST website. Sean, I want to delve into your own organizational experiences that relate to sort of everybody, but you mentioned contact tracing, and I actually want to delve into this because I think everybody is fascinated by this is a whole new world that we're delving into from a security and privacy perspective. Could you talk about the uniqueness of that? Because whether or not we're managing that in our own organizations, we are all going to be impacted by the efficacy of contact tracing.
Absolutely. So as we fight COVID-19 and we are, shall we say, reopening society well ahead of having it and at the point of an inoculation, we have this massive undertaking across the entirety of the nation. And what we're going to find is it's highly likely that we're going to have increased spread across the nation because, again, there is no inoculation, and we have to move forward to getting at least some people back to work and moving some of our economy forward. And with that then comes this whole aspect of contact tracing. And contact tracing comes out of the medical fields. And for those, again, that know me, I come out of Mayo Clinic and medical is my background. But what we're doing is we're really determining what the interactions of individuals are and how those interactions happen with people who have been infected with COVID-19, and then who are the people who are going to be at high risk of infection. And when you start having those conversations, from a clinical point of view, it makes a huge amount of sense. Everyone is very, very excited about this from a clinical point of view. We can help find infections faster. We can help stop other people infections downstream. But then once you start talking security and privacy, instantly you have a huge swath of the nation who looks out and says, wait a minute, what is Big Brother doing to me? What are you really tracking? What can you really get to? I have been interviewed, I can't tell you how many times, by news agencies so far saying, well, wait a minute, what if the Koreans get it, right? What if China gets it? And they kind of get all excited about nation state actors getting that data. The reality is that contact tracing is exceptionally benign information on the whole. There are aspects of contact tracing that do check your locations and manage locations, but in the systems that we've enabled so far, you can't even get to that data yourself unless you have the code from your phone. That code is randomly generated by your device when it's set up. You then can hand that code over to the Department of Health or whoever's doing the investigation for a COVID case. The reality is that this is good information that's helping to save lives. The folks who get worried, I'm one of those. I can put on my tinfoil hat some days too, and I can definitely ask those questions. But I would say that the contact tracing that we're seeing implemented across the country really is very, very specific data to that individual. It's specific about their interactions and locations. And it's only data that is accessible to the states or to any government agency if that individual allows it. So whether you're using the Apple and Google tool sets or whether you're using Care19 or whichever app you're using, they're really all integrated that way so that it is very, very private. And there's really no data there that is accessible from any sort of bad actor. A bad actor who goes after that data will have a whole lot easier time stealing it from your video games than it would be from any of these systems. So that location data that's there is really no different than your typical graphic location data. But it definitely causes a stir in the public, and I understand that, completely understand that. But in the grand scheme of things, this is information that is going to help us manage the virus before we have an inoculation. It's going to help us contain the virus. And in all, this really is going to help us save lives. Ryan, you're still on mute there for a second.
Yeah,
there you go.
Work. Here we go. It's fascinating stuff. I welcome questions from the audience about that, given this is an area that I think is a little bit different than the shift from data center to a cloud environment here. Brian Ware, your organization, obviously, like all of us, is not only focused on your external mission, but your internal mission. I know Palo Alto Networks is a company, 7,000 employees, 150 countries. We had a head start and an ability to move remotely, but that scope and scale, speed was just different in this situation, and we learned things, and we've certainly learned it from our customer set. What, we look at, do you have the remote capability, first of all? Can you scale it fast enough? And also, can your supply chain do the same, whether that's, your comms and IT capability, similarly, your manufacturing capability, and how does that play in some of the guidance that DHS has put out around critical infrastructure? How did CISA adapt internally from a workforce perspective to moving remote?
Yeah, I feel like we did pretty well, and maybe in comparison to some of our defense and intel colleagues did extremely well. Before we moved into a telework posture, we were already using cloud services for email and communications and so forth, and so just proliferating those, expanding that deployment was very doable. I think the most interesting thing, at least from where I sit, and I think a lot of other business executives are in the same position, is to realize how much of our mission we can do at an unclassed level, which means how much of our mission we can do without having to come into the office, that we can do through telework. And so really, I feel like we've been able to do most of the mission without impact. And so we're going to, moving forward, I expect that we will do more and more work from home, more and more work that's not centralized in the national capital region or in a facility, because we've been able to leverage this technology in ways that allow us to achieve an acceptable level of mission performance. There will always be things that we have to do that are classified or facilities focused, where we have to touch a piece of computer hardware. And so, we have certainly identified all of those and the personnel associated and aligned with those, so that they are going in, they're able to go in. We've covered down on the different shifts and locations and fallbacks and so forth. But I think it'll be a priority for me that we continue, and just kind of building on what Jeff said before, we continue to evaluate the teleworking products, work with the vendors to address vulnerabilities and risks, work with CIOs and CISOs to ensure that they put in place the right controls. And so we'll be doing this ourselves. And I think we're going to be looking for solutions too. And I say this to the entrepreneurs and the product companies that are out there. We're going to be looking for solutions over the midterm, maybe the long term, that enable us to have more secure, more confident, more resilient teleworking, over time. I think there's still new products and new solutions to bring to market in that area.
That's great, Brian. If I could follow up on that a little bit, because you mentioned some of the guidance that gets to your external mission as well, and we've had a few questions come in about guidance. Philip Niedermeyer, CEO of the National Cyber Group, had a question about whether or not there are any security evaluations going on for any of these virtual tools. I would add to that as well. I think what has been a new product coming out of DHS is not just general guidelines, but product-specific configuration recommendations, even broken down by the audience, so the IT and the security professionals versus the individual users. Could you talk about first the shift that you've made to be very explicit in some of that configuration guidelines on a product level, and also to Philip's question, whether or not you see security checks as part of that mission down the road.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. And I would have gotten in a lot of trouble had I not mentioned this. So there is, on the CISA.gov website, there is a section of that website that is all about telework guidance, telework products. Looking ahead, what we've done is an initial cut of identifying the 12 largest, by some measure of market share and use, the 12 largest deployed products. And for each of those products, we've had some general kind of overviews, but for each of those products, our intention is to work directly with the vendors, and we are working with the vendors now to address vulnerabilities. And then we will have specific guidance for each of those products available on the website. And we'll have it, to your point, at different levels of technical depth, but I want to be at the place where CVEs are noted so that we can make decisions based on the vulnerability enumerations. I want to be at the place where we're recommending specific controls to put in place at the admin level or at the user level. But yes, we are working with the vendors directly now. We are. It's a new. It's a new environment for us. These are not the kinds of tools that we focused a whole lot on before, but they're the tools that we're going to be working with for the next year, 2 years, maybe more. And so security testing, vulnerability testing, all of those things are in the remit now, and you'll be seeing. I hope what will happen, and I expect what will happen, is that as we engage with each of these companies, they'll be working internally to make their products better. And we've had a number of engagements with many of the companies that whose teleworking products we use. But we'll also be able to provide some additional guidance on where we think there are still risks and how to best manage those risks if these are products that you are using.
Great. Yeah, I will say it's been fantastic from a partnership perspective that you all have reached out to the cybersecurity community, folks like Palo Alto Networks and our peers and competitors across the industry, to understand what are the best practices that we're seeing. How do we leverage these tools? And also in generating ideas for what upcoming blogs would be. So I think to the call to action mantra around JSAC, this community, I'm certain, has a lot of ideas that could help inform CISA and where to move, where the greatest need is, those sort of things. Sean Riley, your external mission includes helping a lot of groups across the state that are not used to telework at all, from state legislators to teachers and educators, and those of us who are trying to Zoom for kids, which is an interesting experience on any platform. How are you working with those parts of the ecosystem that this is a whole new ballgame for?
So our environment, having this very large 7-branch of government environment, is really interesting. So we were awarded this authority, or we got this authority from the legislature this past July. So we're still under a year into this, and we have been able to deploy our tool sets across almost all of the executive branch, and then to bits and pieces of the other 6 branches. But what ends up happening is we have found across all of these different governmental entities, if there ever was a tool, they have it. So any kind of virtual meeting tool that's ever existed in the history of the last 20 years, somebody bought it somewhere and is still using it, along with different configurations and everything else that exists locally. So what we've been doing is we've had to be pretty stringent in how we've approached policy, and things like Teams versus Merle versus Slack versus Zoom and all these products. Not holding anything against any of those products. We just simply had to say, this is the one product that is available, and in our case, it's Teams. And we basically blocked everything else across the entire environment. And in the case of cybersecurity incidents that have happened. We had several schools get bombed on one end. We had some libraries get hit. We don't necessarily blame the tools. We again have that same problem as you said. The individuals who have never had to configure these things, never thought of it from the point of view of security, using old configurations and old versions. We literally had to just go and block all that technology across the board and really force an overall standard across the entire enterprise. And you can imagine in government where every government entity is very, very independent and very unique and very separate from each other. You can imagine how popular I was for a couple of days. But the reality is that once people started to see a huge decrease in their cyber incidents, the acceptance has gone up substantially. And right now, we're still pushing those technologies out across the board, but we also have a lot of adoption that has to happen. Legislators are a perfect example. You know, your average legislator, state legislator in the United States is 68 years old. They aren't necessarily well-versed in these technologies. They aren't necessarily something they've ever had to use before. So we've had to spend a lot of time on adoption. We took 50% of our programming team in the first 2 weeks, moved our all of our programmers across the state, moved them all into help desk and training and helping to be able to take calls, because simply we were at 400% higher volumes than our previous record calls. But we made those kind of shifts to be able to help make sure that we could take care of our customers and make sure people could get connected and move forward. And now, being approximately 8 weeks in, I wouldn't say it's second nature to everybody, but the percentage of folks that it is second nature for is definitely climbing really, really fast. And we'll just keep on adapting and keep on overcoming at this point.
That's great stuff. Jeff Green, over to you. We've got a question from the audience from Paul Dodd. He asks, how do you see the adoption of telework affecting legacy security policies? You know, ban on split tunnel VTN or ban on bring your own device. One of the key mechanisms that particularly government has had and some enterprises had is just to lock down what you're able to use and rely upon. And what we're seeing is exactly what Sean said. Now that we're in this sort of Wild West environment, everything is connected and every tool is being leveraged. So how do you see that evolution in policies? So
from writ large and from an NCCOE perspective, I think it's really put an emphasis on our zero trust work and deployment, use of zero trust architecture. When I went back through the publications on telework and BYOD, there were a lot of zero trust concepts in there, but they weren't described as such and they weren't grouped together. It was still more of the perimeter concept. And what Brian said earlier about the perimeter has now moved to the teenager on TikTok. And you know, what our ZT guys would say is, well, let's just give up the illusion that there is a perimeter and approach it from that way. So we have a zero trust architecture project. We just published the project description on it. That we'll start building on that this fall. I think that is going to be essential. You know, I was talking with some of the folks working on that, and the project's going forward primarily as we conceived of it, but as we build and are thinking about it is definitely being impacted by the fact that we've moved into a different flavor of need for zero trust. You know, it's driven by cloud and IoT, but it really wasn't focused on home IoT as much. And I think that that's something we're going to have to factor in. And when we put out our white paper on the telework update, I think we're going to have zero trust concepts in there, but discussing it more from that focus. So I think you're going to see that zero trust tools and zero trust concepts hitting more quickly and in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. The automation is just going to become more and more important, so that to your point, the perimeter is gone, and to the other point, the perimeter is everywhere, right? So you need visibility and enforcement points throughout your enterprise, and your enterprise just expanded dramatically into what is part of that. Follow-on question for Brian from Elad Uran, CEO of Security Growth Partners. Securing a remote workforce includes many elements. We just heard that from Jeff right now, including security for mobile comms. when it comes to securing the remote workforce, what's the role of mobile communication security, specifically end-to-end encrypted voice calls, chats, messaging, et cetera?
Yeah, I think in just the spirit of what I was saying before, mobile is a huge part of that. I know that with my leadership team and with my colleagues across the interagency, we're pretty regularly on mobile devices, whether they're iPads or iPhones or Android phones or whatnot. And so, I think there's a whole suite of solutions that we're going to need, many of which we have now, but we probably didn't buy them with the expectation or deploy them with the expectation that we were going to be relying on them exclusively or relying on them largely. And so I think we'll just come back around and we're going to reassess the way that we're doing mobile device management and the way that we're leveraging mobile devices. And, are there aspects of that that do not provide us with all of the risk mitigation that we, or ability to manage risk that we need. So mobile, home, absolutely. I think I think this is what's going to come out of there's the joke about, who led the digital transformation in your enterprise? Was it the CEO? Was it the chief technology officer? Or was it COVID? And COVID is the fuel that's energizing all of our digital transformation efforts, from the things that we're talking about here to any number of other refinements to business processes that I think we're going to see across industries and government. So yeah, absolutely on the mobile side.
Yeah, fully agree. Sean, let's turn a little bit to talk about how you're interacting with critical infrastructure in your state. There's been some publicity around your neighbors in South Dakota and some of the challenges that they've had at some of the meat processing facilities. Your work, due to just chance and COVID outbreak, has been in the energy sector. How have you worked through that overall?
Yeah, so when it comes to critical infrastructure, healthcare is the number one that we work with, but energy has become kind of this unexpected component. And in the energy sector, one of our critical infrastructure sites that had a COVID outbreak was actually a windmill production site. So they build and manufacture windmills for all over the country. And that is a huge challenge. And what you end up working with in that case is sitting down with the organizations and understanding what their impacts are across their teams, but not only from the perspective of the virus in itself, but also from the perspective of how do we take an organization that's critical to the state and critical to national infrastructure and help them be able to work differently. And you get into this kind of odd spot where we are government, so we're not really a private sector come to fix your problem, but at the same time as we have all kinds of tools and capabilities. So we definitely meet with folks and walk through what the options are and how we can expand for them. One thing was simply the contact tracing. Everybody installed it. The whole group installed it to be able to go through so that we could help make sure that we could find anybody who had an exposure, anyone who needed to be in quarantine, or anyone who just downstream may be impacted directly by the disease. But it's not something we expected to have. Healthcare, we definitely did, but we didn't expect to have all these kind of other services coming in.
Yeah, critical infrastructure has become fascinating and more than just sort of this esoteric exercise of 16 different sectors, formerly 18 for those of you that really enjoyed the interagency process. Brian Ware, personally having spent 12 plus years between DHS and NSC, we've always focused on things, for example, like aviation, particularly post 9/11, and with flight travel down 93%, everybody is locked in their homes, and the food supply chain has gone front and center with things like grocery stores becoming at the forefront of critical infrastructure. As Sean mentioned, healthcare is certainly top of mind, and we go first to how do you provide security to hospitals that have long been victim of things like ransomware and now have been in a massive rush to just deal with capacity and stand up ICUs and potentially temporary hospitals. But more holistically within the health sector, as DHS and FBI just recently put out a bulletin talking about the threats from China onto intellectual property of vaccine makers. So Brian, talk to us a little bit about how you all are interfacing with critical infrastructure and specifically how you're helping to address some of those challenges in COVID-specific elevated priority critical infrastructure.
That is a great question. And I'll just say that you're right. There were the 18 critical sectors, and then we dropped a couple, and then we had to add elections, and they're useful as an organizing construct. But I think, a few years back, we recognized that there were some things that they just didn't quite do for us from a utility standpoint. And we began working on what we call the national critical functions, which was really a way of, it addressed a number of things. One of them is that some things don't break cleanly within one sector. They're functions that are inherently interconnect several sectors, but it also allowed us to get to the idea of things like providing healthcare as a function. And so that construct, which was really, it's fairly new. We've been able to leverage that analytical framework to really look at our COVID operations. And I think right now the most broadly accepted and linked and referenced document that CISA has ever produced is our National Critical Workers Guidance, which has been adopted by all 50 states, some of them exactly as written and some of them with kind of edits and additions. But that identified the kinds of businesses that are critical to the economy and more specifically the critical to our medical response, our food and everything else. And we continue to analyze within that construct to try to identify kind of nuanced parts of the economy, nuanced parts of our COVID response that we really need to focus on. And then we are able to work with FEMA through, with FEMA to all of the affected industries as well as to the states. Now, COVID specifically, or the pharma bit specifically, I think, we know that there are adversaries that are targeting our pharmaceutical research. The companies, the universities, the labs, every country to some degree is anxiously awaiting an antiviral or a vaccine to be deployed. And this country is the hub of innovation and creativity. And I fully expect that the United States will be significantly part of the development of that vaccine, significantly part of the production of the vaccine that's really going to change the world and change the situation that we're in now. And so we have taken significant additional measures to protect the pharmaceutical companies that are developing these vaccines, to protect the universities. We're doing that, everything from doing coordinating threat briefs with our IC colleagues to providing enhanced cybersecurity scanning services targeted at them, and a whole host of other options. And again, I think it's some of the most important work that we've done. It really, the vision for CISA has always been to protect critical infrastructure, not just the .gov, but to take what we know from the intelligence community and translate it down into the core parts of our economy. And again, I think that the challenging circumstances we find ourselves in now are enabling us to really execute the mission the way that CISA was designed to execute the mission. In this case, protecting critical infrastructure. And it's a new kind of critical infrastructure in some ways, or a new set of priorities for critical infrastructure. But we're certainly there from a cyber perspective, as well as the other work we've done on critical worker guidance and so forth.
Yeah, again, I'd give DHS a lot of credit. The guidance that you've put out on critical infrastructure has been incredibly valuable to us as a company, both because we're critical infrastructure and we service critical infrastructure, but our manufacturers came to us trying to understand guidance as they were facing, do we stay open, do we close, how do we work in a safe way, and to be able to map both DHS guidance down to the state level and down to the counties in California, where we're considered critical infrastructure and the customer base has been hugely impactful. I will also, again, to that call to action piece, DHS continues to do a critical infrastructure call. It was twice weekly. Now I think it's on Tuesdays, but there's been some tremendously valuable information and opportunity for bidirectional exchange. Also, just to understand some external forces. I think you had folks from the U.S. consulate in Mexico talk about the supply chain implications because Mexico's ventilator and hospital capacity was so low compared to a population of well over 100 million. They had to be overly restrictive in the social distancing and the social restrictions to prevent the spread. It's been fascinating, and it has real world impacts on all of us across the ecosystem. So that's been great. And on the information sharing piece as well, real granular bidirectional operational sharing of threats to critical infrastructure has been really helpful, and a credit to DHS to leaning forward on that. Sean Riley, you all have experienced some really interesting challenges in dealing with the threats to tribal communities and the COVID-19 impacts. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you're working through it?
Yeah, so the tribal communities are really set up in a different way from most of the other governments that you have. So a tribal nation is really a sovereign nation, and they act really no differently than interacting with, Canada or Germany or another country. And within many of our states, we have these tribal locations and tribal nations that are set up. And within the state of North Dakota, we have 5. So it's really like having 5 different comprehensively separate countries inside of our own state. And what we all have been trying to do is really work together to be able to succeed together in this new cyber world. But the reality is that when you start working with 5 different countries that have 5 totally different rule sets, it becomes really, really complicated. And everything from a tribe having its own cell phone provider that no one anywhere has ever heard of, because that cell phone provider only exists in that tribal location, to then all the shared agreements that we have for law enforcement agreements, and where both organizations, I should say, the state and the tribal nation, can share police officers, they can share ambulance, and all these components. It's made things very interesting because right away as COVID kicked in, one of the tribal nations believed they needed to shut their borders. So they started blocking off streets and roads and trying to treat it as a close the border kind of situation, the same as we saw in some other locations around the world. And you can fully understand why they would have taken that action. But all of a sudden, when you've got barriers across interstate highway, because of where it goes, that causes all sorts of havoc. So it means that you have to interact with those groups very differently. You have to respect that they are indeed sovereign, but we have to come to an agreement of how to help each other. And we did get those roads all figured out. And today, we as a state are offering services from a cyber defense to each of those tribal nations. They kind of get a different option than what your typical government would get. They get an option to kind of purchase from us like we were a managed service, but so they can kind of pick and choose what they want to use. But it's a very interesting relationship. It's something that, frankly, unless you've dealt with, you really wouldn't even know that it happens this way inside the United States. But I know many of the states, especially the Western states, have reservations and they work through these issues. And but again, at the end of the day, it's all about trying to help each other get to where we're all safe from the virus. It's at the end of the day, it's trying to help each other so we make sure that we're safe from those bad actors out there. But it is definitely a very, very different world integrating with those tribes in comparison to just working across your typical state lines.
Yep. It's certainly interesting stuff as we're all obviously dealing across borders with our individual organizations. It's unique that you're dealing it within your borders and across borders as well. Jeff Green, we've heard a little bit about the initial products, the move to more nimble things like blogs and videos with an initial focus on the user, as well as some things like video teleconferencing capabilities. Could you talk a little bit about, I think you've got some upcoming input opportunities to focus on next products, cloud, the rest. What are next steps for you guys?
Yeah, most immediate and most relevant now is we are beginning the process of updating, as I mentioned, the guidance on telework and BYOD. So anyone out there who wants to provide feedback, please feel free to reach out to me. I can connect you up and give you a sense of what we're working on. More broadly, as I mentioned, our Zero Trust Architecture project description is public, and we are receiving and adjudicating comments on that. It would be interesting to look back on how the tenor of them may have changed over time as people have adapted to more remote work. We also, in the next day or so, are going to publish a project description on 5G security. So we are looking at how 5G security implications with industry partners, again, I think the ones you'd expect. So that's an area where we can look at it. And the final thing that we've started to put together, not so much directly related to the security considerations of today, but if we are going to be in a remote work world long term, is crypto agility as we move into a post-quantum world. Can't really do too much on exactly what the new algorithms will be, but we've started a community of interest looking at what considerations organizations need to think about now, what they can do now to speed the adoption of the new algorithms when they come out. Historically, looking back, we've seen it's taken 10 to 15 years to fully adopt new crypto algorithms. Once we get into post-quantum, we're going to need to move more quickly. So that COI, community of interest, is kicking off now. And there was a question earlier about fully encrypted comms, and we need to make sure that they're still encrypted in that post-quantum world.
Yes, indeed. Brian Ware, again, you've got an active community here looking to contribute. What is most helpful for you, either from soliciting sort of direction on next steps, sharing threats? What's the best way for folks to reach out to DHS, partner with CISA from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd say there's a few things. You mentioned the Emergency Support Function 14, ESF 14, which is the critical infrastructure emergency support function call we've been having. It was every day, then went to 2 days a week. I think starting next week, it's on Tuesdays. That's an open call. I encourage you to join. You can find information for that on CISA.gov. We are not just speaking, we are hearing, we're listening, we're trying to address issues as they come up. If there are people listening and you are one of those pharmaceutical companies or public health agency or university researchers on the COVID response campaign, sign up for our cyber hygiene service. It's as easy as an email to vulnerability@cisa.dhs.gov. We'll send you back an information on that and the consent form. We have found a number of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, that's where we started, have already signed up for that service. We have several hundred healthcare organizations that have signed up just in the last few weeks and months. And what we're doing there is we're looking for, it's a scanning service that's going to identify vulnerabilities, and we will work with you to close those vulnerabilities. And in some cases, there are some additional services that we can offer. So I think that's a great, very operational way to engage, but also establishes the connectivity between CISA and the rest of the U.S. government and those firms that are in that industry. But again, on the and then anything else that you need, you mentioned tips and threats and so forth. The U.S. CERT website, which is a CISA website, there's a button right at the top to report anything unusual at a technical level or at a non-technical level. That'll come into our watch and come into us, and we will respond appropriately. So a couple of different initial thoughts there.
Yeah, we actually, real time, I just got a question in about that from universities asking how they should work with CISA. So I think that broad guidance certainly applies to that audience. And again, we've gotten tremendous benefit out of it. I would also suggest as well, ensuring that you are having conversations with your cybersecurity providers and partners. Very early on in the process, we got outreach from a massive grocery store chain outside the US actually that said, could we be prioritized in a time like this? And it helped us sort of refocus our thought on this exact critical infrastructure question and critical functions as Brian and DHS have sort of focused things as well. So in ensuring that you're following all the best practices and maximizing your capabilities is certainly an opportunity I think that everybody has as well. We've got 5 minutes remaining, so I thought I'd go to one easy subject. Sean, as we look down the road, we've got elections coming up. How in 5 minutes would you say that you guys are preparing to go into an election where cyber threats were already a massive area of focus and are now moving into a new environment where we don't know what mix of mail-in balloting will we be able to be in person, et cetera. So go, you're down to 4 minutes.
All right, so the easy answer is blockchain everything. There we go. All right. Yeah, so elections are probably one of the most interesting areas that we're dealing with here in these last 30 days. The reality is that mail-in ballots are a great way to be able to enable voting during this time where we have to keep the social distancing. But I will say from state to state to state, the accuracy of their data to be able to really mail ballots properly is really, really painful. We've talked to states who have sent out, for every roughly 250,000 ballots that they've sent out, they're getting about 100,000 of them returned to them. And that's because the data that they have in regards to where people live and all the census information is old, and that information doesn't get updated constantly. Many different places, different states have different tenures of time for their driver's license. And for most states, the driver's license is the one and only address that they really keep for people. So a lot of folks that never had a driver's license, and this is very common in some of the metro areas where you get a lot of, especially millennials, who just never saw value in getting a driver's license, don't have an address that's actually in a system with some of the states. Now, there's a lot of voter registration aspects that you would expect would be able to fix that, but the reality is voter registration isn't always up to date either. So what we're finding is that the cyber security vulnerability can be very high in many places simply because the methodology that's used to track someone's address wasn't seen as incredibly critical previously. And it simply because voter registration was the one and only way in which they managed addresses. And now they're looking at DOT systems, they're looking at all kinds of other systems to try to get that information, because now they're trying to be as comprehensive as they can with those ballots. And what that's given us now is a whole lot of learning during these primary season. It's actually somewhat of a huge advantageous moment to have this primary season ahead of the general election. It's given us a lot of learnings, understanding of where we can go with the systems. But as we march forward and get towards the general election, yeah, I'd love to be able to blockchain vote across the board. I don't think anybody's going to let me do that, but they still believe that the mail is more secure than the internet when it comes to legislators. I don't think that's true. I would much rather try my chances with blockchain, but but we're going to have to just spin up a lot of new technology and a lot of new security models around addressing mail systems, registration systems, to make sure that not only do we defend against the bad guys, but also do we make sure that as many people who are supposed to be voting are voting. And it's, yeah, that's a couple-hour conversation all on its own right.
Well, you did very well in 3 minutes and a half there. So I do think, obviously that's just the tip of the iceberg, but most of those concerns are just the starting point for the voter rolls, right? That's not securing the systems themselves. And North Dakota does have some tremendous security capabilities that you're allowed to bring. And I think certainly DHS and many in the federal government, even in DOD, would be envious of your span of control and influence to actually, as you enumerated on the education side, have a single tool set and put people behind a single set of controls. So perhaps this could be a future JSAC set. Brian Ware, anything you want to discuss for DHS as we move into election security?
Well, look, it's to Sean's point, we are still not recommending any electronic voting, which leaves us to polling places and the mail. And we know that that's going to shift the risk picture a bit, putting more focus on voter registration databases and so forth than we might have expected. If it was all going to be polling stations, we would have expected a significant amount of risk there that may shift to some other parts of the kind of voting ecosystem. But we are very actively engaged. It is still a significant priority for us and our partners in the DoD and FBI. And we're working more closely together than we've ever worked before, and hoping for and expecting a secure election.
Great. Well, to be continued. Certainly, we welcome input from the community as we continue to think of what are the most burning topics we could leverage this forum for and continue to collaborate on in the real world. We're hitting time right now, so Jeff, I'm going to spare you the election question. And thank everyone for participating. Sean Riley, Jeff Green, Brian Ware, the organizations behind you, and all that you are doing. Thanks again to all the attendees. We are building some future modules as well, and we'll have some more of these types of panels. We have one developing right now on DoD and the remote warfighter. So looking forward to continuing the dialogue and continuing to collaborate in between these JSAC sessions. Thanks, everybody.